Today I'm going to be talking about Origen. Origen is a figure who was born in 184, died in the mid-3rd century, so he was himself one of the chief, maybe the chief theologian in Christendom during the 3rd century. He marks a new generation of thinkers who really is, in a sense, a natural follow-up to Philo, because what he does is take Philo's scheme, Philo's method of putting the Hebrew scriptures together with Platonic philosophy, and put Platonism, you might say, thoroughly in a Christian context. Now, in doing that, it's not that he's particularly fond of Plato himself. In fact, he's contemptuous of other Christians who think that somehow Plato and Aristotle were given a kind of divine revelation and could only have said what they said because they had that spark of divinity in them. No, Plato was a pagan. And in fact, Origen hated paganism. He hated, you might say, the classical environment that he was well educated in. He knew Plato thoroughly, he knew Greek poetry thoroughly, but nevertheless he was contemptuous of it, partly because his own father died a martyr's death, was put to death for being a Christian. And so Origen was not a fan of classical culture, even though he himself was heavily steeped in it, and adopts many of its assumptions in his work. He was himself an ascetic. He believed that the purpose of human life is to work, turn toward God, so he ate very little, slept very little. There was a story, in fact, that he took a verse in Matthew literally and castrated himself. However, most people think that was actually something that his enemies put out to discredit him. In any case, he was somebody who did have a lot of enemies, who took Christianity very seriously, and adopted it in terms of his personal life in a rather harsh form, and in the process made, well, a lot of enemies. Now, what I want to do is look today at his work on principles, sometimes translated as on first principles, de principiis, because what it does is begin with an image of God that I think is really deeply Platonic in a certain way. So if we start thinking, about what Origen was doing, I think it's quite illuminating, and that's part of what you can see. Yeah, this is very reminiscent, by the way, of the constant search for talk. My first, well, actually, it's not true. My second teaching job was at a Hebrew-based school in Pittsburgh, and the students would get to the classroom in front of me and throw all the chalk out the bag, which was difficult because I was teaching geometry and physical sciences. It was like, how do you teach geometry without chalk? I mean, I guess the Greeks did it. They drew diagrams in the sand, but we didn't have any sand. This was Pittsburgh. And so anyway, I had to start carrying chalk around with me. I remember the first day, they were so proud of themselves. They had again thrown the chalk out the window, and I reached in the pocket of my coat and pulled out a piece of chalk. They were crushed. It was awesome. Anyhow, yes. So Origen gives us an approach to understanding God. And here's how we begin. Really to understand this, I've been drawing lots of diagrams, and we'll do that today, but I want to actually see how this develops out of the text itself. He begins on God, and then he moves to the Son of God, of Christ, and then he moves to the Holy Spirit. And you find in a series of theologians here that on God, that goes on for page after page. Then on Christ, well, page after page. And then you get to the Holy Spirit, and poor Holy Spirit just gets, well, more than I remembered, actually, but considerably less. And so what we're going to look at is sort of how that understanding progresses. He's maybe the first theologian in the Christian tradition who actually has a lot to say about the nature of these various persons of God. Okay, on God. I know that some will attempt to say that even according to the declarations of our own scriptures, God is a body, because in the writings of Moses they find it said that our God is a consuming fire. And in the Gospel, according to John, that God is a spirit, and they who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Fire and spirit, according to them, to be regarded as nothing else than a body. Now, I should like to ask these persons what they have to say respecting that passage where it's declared that God is light. As John writes in his epistle, God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Truly, he is that light which illumines the whole understanding of those who are capable of receiving truth. As it is said in the 36th Psalm, in thy light we shall see light. Now notice he is making a lot of reference to Scripture. He does that all the way throughout. He prefers to argue on the basis of revelation rather than strictly philosophical argument per se. But in thinking about God, what really inspires is that equation. God is light. Now, when he says God is light, in the context of Plato, actually, this has a huge significance. God is light. Well, let's continue and see where he goes with this, because I think it will start reminding you of a particular passage in Plato. For what other light of God can be named in which anyone sees light, save an influence of God, by which man, being enlightened, either thoroughly sees the truth of all things or comes to know God himself, who is called the truth. Such is the meaning of the expression, in thy light we shall see light. In thy word and wisdom is thy Son. In himself we shall see thee the Father. Because he is called light, shall he be supposed to have any resemblance to the light of the sun? Or how shall there be the slightest ground for imagining that from the corporeal light anyone could derive the cause of knowledge and come to an understanding of truth? Okay, now, passage of Plato that he has in mind, that works in the background. Yeah?
The cave?
The cave, exactly, the allegory of the cave. Who can tell me about Plato's allegory of the cave or a poem? Yeah, good.
He's telling a story about how one can see truth. Because, for most people, they're bound, they can't turn their head. They're bound, they're in a cave, there's a light behind them. And then the figures that are moving in the light are projected imperfectly on the wall of the cave that they're in. So they can't move, they're completely trapped. But when they're eventually able to, if they were able to move, then they would slowly turn away from the images and realize that they are images, and then have to exit the cave and have to kind of probe around first because they don't really know what all the images really are. And once they see the images and they start to get used to them, then they'll actually try to look at the sun directly.
Excellent. Okay, yes. So, I'm going to try to draw a picture of this. This is a mistake. I probably told you I studied art for about a year. What a waste of time. And if you don't, it's not that studying art is a waste of time, it's that my studying art is a waste of time, as you shall see. Anyway, here's the idea. Yes, most of us are trapped like prisoners in a cave. Very strange prisoners, very strange cave. But it's something that to us is much less strange than it would have been to Plato's own audience, because we have a familiar experience of something like this. He's talking about something like a movie theater. Okay, so everybody is there in the theater, and up here projected on a screen, or actually in Plato, it's really figures. There's a sort of fire here, and little puppets, and the puppets, the shadows are cast up on the screen. But for our purposes, think of this as a movie screen. And here are all the people, okay, sitting here in rows, and they are chained to their seats in such a way that they can't look around and see what's going on around them. They can only look at the screen. Moreover, they spend their entire lives. It's not like they go in for a couple of hours and then leave. No, they've grown up here. This is all they know. Okay? So they're going to see various images on the screen, and they'll see these images. Actually, that's like the Flintstones' house. But anyway, they're going to see various images on the screen, and they'll think that's reality. They will hear sounds. They will think it's coming from the things on the screen, and so they will believe that this is reality. Now, there is an exit out the back, and indeed, some intrepid prisoner finally manages to free himself and realizes that actually he's in an arcade. He manages to move around and see these, and so leaves and walks up out of this cave, and then suddenly looks at the world as most of us know it. But what happens then? Well, having been accustomed to the dark, right? What happens when you go out of a movie theater? Initially, it's hard to adjust, right? It's very, very bright. So at first, the person can't even see. They see shadows. So they look at shadows, reflections, and a few things like that. Eventually, they can turn and look at ordinary objects like trees and so on. And then, at a certain point, they realize the whole thing is being illumined by the sun. Perhaps they can even look at the sun. Now, what is all of this supposed to signify in Plato? Actually, he tells you. You don't have to sort of guess at the interpretation, because Socrates in a interlocutor basically says, well, this is a very strange image you've given us, Socrates. What's this all about? And Socrates tells us, this is the way most of us are. We are trapped looking at these things that are really just shadows and reflections of the true realities. We think these are objects, so these are the objects of experience, the objects we actually encounter in the everyday world. And we think that's the reality, but in fact, that's not the reality. And eventually we can come to free ourselves and see that those are not the realities. We come outside and we see the true nature of things. Now at first we just see shadows and reflections, but then we can see objects. And really now, the images, here we're down seeing shadows and objects and things like that. Here, what do things like the trees correspond to? Well, these are like the forms. And so this is like the ascent into the intelligible world, the world of the forms. We can eventually turn out and we see some reflections, we see shadows, we see images of the forms in objects. So really these are, you might say, images of the forms, i.e. the properties that particular material objects have. And we see the strikingness of the shirt, for example, or the whiteness of the top. We are aware of the form being embodied in particular things, but then we turn to the forms themselves, and eventually maybe we can look at the sun. Now, this is really the answer in one form to the objection. How is it possible to know the forms? Well, somehow the realm of forms is illuminated by the sun. Okay, there is something that actually sheds light in the realm of forms for us and enables us to see it. And so Plato then tells us the story of the divided line, basically saying, aha, yes, there's a basic division between the shadows, reflections of objects. They're not really, in a sense, there, but they sort of are. That's when you see your image in the mirror. Yeah.
If the things outside are just images of the forms, what's the difference between just looking at those images and the images in the cave?
All right, so that's a good question. Because when we get here are ordinary material objects, and then over here he says there's a similar division between what he refers to as the mathematical forms, and then the more abstract forms, like the form of goodness. And you get the sense that the limit over here is indeed the form of the good, which acts like the sun. But now, right, in our image, what's going on? Well, in his version, you're really seeing shadows. And in a sense, that's true on a movie screen, right? You're seeing projections, you're not seeing actual objects. And so their shadows and reflections is mistaking for objects. But then eventually you can see objects. I think what he means by the shadows and reflections up here at this level, in part you're getting a replay of the shadow. These are shadows of those, just as those are shadows. So one way of interpreting the shadows up here is to think he's talking about the mathematical forms. You see shapes. You see certain things like that that lead you to think about more abstract things. But another way of taking it is, well, what do you encounter? Where do you encounter the forms first, as embodied in particular things? You don't think about whiteness per se. You think about the whiteness of the wall or the whiteness of the chalk. You don't think about blue per se. You think of the blue of the shirt or the blue of this box, and then you move to something more abstract. Now, admittedly, there are two ways of taking this sort of thing. One is, yes, these are the forms as embodied in particular objects. The other way of taking it is, think of mathematical forms. You see shapes, in other words. So this would be one interpretation. Another is, look, you start seeing the shapes of things. You start reflecting on shapes and things like number, and that leads you to a more abstract reflection. The way in which this maps into the divided line is a little bit vague, it seems to me. Go ahead.
Is he saying there's like an enhanced quality to looking at things through the light of the sun versus the light of, well, I guess it would still be the sun in the cave, it would just be like a reflection of it then, right?
Well, that's true, because really this light ultimately comes from the energy of the sun as well. So even the fire in the cave, or in our modern version, even the energy of the projector is in some way derivative from the sun. So yeah, even down here, what's going on is really due to the power of the sun, even if people aren't aware of it. Now, go ahead.
Isn't this just be the background for when St. Paul writes in Corinthians, I see partially as through a mirror, but then I see completely.
Oh, very nice. Okay, when Paul says that, now I see through a mirror darkly, it's as if, look, now I'm down in the cave, right? But then I'll see face to face, then I'll be up out of the cave. And so indeed, an image in Paul, and an image that Origen likes very much, is this is really something like this world, okay? It's not just this world before we study philosophy, which is sometimes the impression you get in Socrates. It's like, yeah, most people, they are walking around thinking this world is real, just like people in this cave. But those of us who study philosophy, we know the truth. We study the forms. Okay, I don't know why Arnold is like it was a great philosopher here. But anyway, that's something that you might say, yeah, we are the ones who do this, and you know. But no, I think Origen says, look, as Paul says there, we're all trapped in this world. Okay, this is the world we're in. Maybe we can think about this. And indeed, both affirm that we can think about this. However, this is really where we are now. On the other hand, what is our true home? Now we see as in a mirror darkly, but then face to face. Okay, so this world is, you might say, for both Paul, I think, and for Origen, our true home. Okay, really, there's this other realm which is our true home, and we are like visitors, we are like prisoners in this world. Now, what is the function of the sun in this image? If God is like the sun, what role is the sun playing in Plato's picture? It's playing several roles.
It's the source of truth and allows you to understand the purpose.
Excellent. Okay, so yes, God is light. One of the things that means is source of truth. Absolutely. In fact, he says, well, at some point, we can also say God is truth. The forms are the things that enable us to have knowledge. They are the things that enable us to actually know truths. In fact, they make objective truth possible. Okay, so we talked about that some last time. What is the role of the forms? It's really in part to allow your thinking and my thinking to latch onto the same thing and to allow us, in effect, to get out of our own heads to attain some degree of objective knowledge. So the possibility of objectivity, of truth, these are things that are due to, well, in this image, the sun, for Origen, God. It's really God who is playing this role. He's taking over that idea for Philo, and you might say it's implicit in Plato himself. But right, we've got God as the source of truth, the source of objectivity. What else does it mean? What else is the sun doing? Yeah.
Allowing us to see the truth.
Exactly. So it's not only the source of truth, it is also the source of knowledge. Okay? Whatever we can see is made possible because of the light of the sun. Even if it's the light very indirectly now here. And so we're really capable of knowing things because of the light of the sun. Here's, in a way, I think the thing that is driving Origen in the background. If you look at the Platonic picture, and you think, how is it possible for me to know thinking at all? Suppose there are no forms. Suppose I'm just stuck down here. Then I'm merely in the world of appearance, as he thinks of it. But it's worse than that. Really, I'm trapped inside my own head. I've got this idea, and so I say, aha, here's a piece of chalk. And I have various associations with pieces of chalk. So do you. Your mental concept, you might say, of chalk is different from mine. For example, at least before this class, you had no association with chalk as being a valuable thing because people were likely to throw it out the window. That's part of my association with chalk. And so you might think, well, okay, this is something that really, I can say this is chalk, you can say this is chalk, but do we mean the same thing? If we're trapped inside our own heads and all we have to refer to are our own concepts, our own ideas, our own images, then maybe not. Maybe we're not even thinking or talking about the same thing. And so what enables us to have knowledge as opposed to just express some opinion that's purely subjective? Well, it's the possibility of there being something outside of us to which we can really attach these concepts, these ideas, these images. And so the forms play that role. So the forms are necessary to serve as this source of truth of objectivity, but then how is it possible for us to know about them? That, I said, is the problem that within Platonism, strictly conceived, you can't solve. But you can solve if you turn the sun here in the form of good into God, because then God can do anything. And in fact, Origen's point is, this is what God the Father at any rate does. God the Father is not only the source of truth, but the source of knowledge by virtue of the thing by virtue of which we are capable of knowing anything at all. Yeah.
I mean, this kind of is a metaphor to the cave itself, but isn't, in a way, the absence of light a source of knowledge just by nature of being able to reflect on the past existence of light? Such as, like, you hold a mental image of the chalk in your head. That's not you actually looking at the chalk, experiencing the chalk right then, but you still have that knowledge of the chalk that existed previously.
Oh, yes, absolutely right. And so it doesn't have to be continuum. For example, now, you forget what this classroom looks like? You forget what I look like? No, right? You can remember even if you can't see right now, although actually it's not that dark. But right, I mean, the light doesn't have to be shining on you continuously. In fact, if we think about this, look, a lot of people don't know a lot of things, right? It's not as if the light is so encompassing that your mind just knows everything. You don't share in God's omniscience. But it gives you capacities. And it's really that capacity, that potential that Origen is concerned with. What you're given is the capacity to know. God, as it were, turns on the light in the realm of forms, giving your mind the capability of knowing the forms. Now, whether you exercise that and actualize that is up to you. And to some extent, that's something that isn't directly given. You still have to think, you still have to reason, you still have to learn from experience and from revelation and from all sorts of things. So there are many sources of knowledge, and you still have to study those. But how is it possible for you to even have the capacity to learn? The answer is, it's God turning on the light bulb, basically, and allowing you to receive something in the realm of forms.
I was just going to make an objection to what you said. You still need light to begin with, not good enough with the child.
Well, exactly right. Even if the light goes out, your knowledge is based on the light having been there, right? And so it's still serving as the source of knowledge, even if it were to stop for some reason. And what would it mean for God's light to shut off from you? I don't know. I mean, here would be one interpretation of hell, for example. Another possibility is, well, suppose something happens and you're just mentally incapacitated. Maybe it's something like that, but that's not to say you couldn't still have this capacity and still have the awareness or the memory or knowledge that stems from the earlier experience of the light. Okay, now this is an important part of what God as light does. Is there anything else, any other purpose that the light serves in this little image?
It sustains life, warmth.
Okay, certainly one thing is, yes, sustains life. And so there is going to be a sense in which everything depends on the sun. In the material world, well, just so, everything depends on God. Not only everything intellectual in the sense of truth, knowledge, and so on, but also just life. Everything depends on that light given by God. So God is not only the creator in the sense of a being that starts the world going, acts as first cause, but also sustains it throughout. It's the underlying source of energy and light. Yeah?
It's kind of an odd question, but we're making a distinction between the light itself and the source.
Ooh, good question. Yeah. There's a difference.
I'm thinking about in terms of like little timeless.
No, very, very good. There's a difference between the sun and the light of the sun. And so, is there something similar here? He says, notice God is light, but I've been sort of switching back and forth, cheating a bit, acting as well, God is the source of light. Is that an important distinction? We should maybe worry about that. Is God the light, or is God the source of God? Well, no, say more about that, because Origen is writing near the end of a sort of Neoplatonic tradition, including people like Plotinus and a variety of others. And so it's all hidden, it's in the background in Origen, which makes it often hard to trace these kinds of influences. But in Plotinus, for example, what would be their role?
It would be like just a difference in like an ontological hierarchy, maybe more real and
good. Right.
Real versus not real. hierarchy of the light.
And so the source would be the higher one, right? And then you would have the light which flows from the source. And remember we talked about emanation as a crucial concept in Neoplatonism, in the Gnostics, but also in all other Neoplatonic thinkers. And the idea behind it really is that God sort of, or whatever the highest being is, overflows naturally. And there is something like an energy, a light, if you will, that flows from that being to other things. Elements of that Neoplatonic picture are still here in Origen. And so, although his quotation is God is light, I think you're right to say we really ought to be more careful and think of God here as the source of the light. The light is what makes possible truth, knowledge, life, and so on, but God is really the source of the light, more so than the light itself, I think. At least if he's trying to be noticing. Well, but it is interesting. He is called light. Shall he be supposed to have any resemblance to the light of the sun? Interestingly, he seems to refer to God as the light here, not the source of the light, which is a departure from that Neoplatonic tradition, and a little bit surprising. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I guess in kind of a way, you think that God is being the sun, and the sun as the light, and they're one and the same, where the sun is God, and you kind of get what I'm trying to say?
Sure. You could sort of say, well, it's dangerous though, because I agree with you. You could sort of think, look, let's just identify the sun with the light. But there's light in this room. There are also lamps overhead providing the light, right? And they're not the same thing. For one thing, as I illustrated a moment ago, I can shut off the lamp, but the lamp is still there even though the light is gone. For another thing, the light is clearly, what is it composed, or the lamp, I should say, what is it composed of? Well, it's composed of, a variety of, actually these are fluorescent bulbs, so there's electricity flowing through a sort of vacuum-filled chamber, and blah, blah, blah. We can talk about chemical composition of the various elements of it. But then, we can think, well, what is the light composed of? Answer, photons. That's different. And so, there's a distinction to be observed, I think, between the lamp and the light. And it would be one could, for various purposes, say, I'm not interested in that distinction. It doesn't matter here. And maybe that's Origen's position. But let's continue reading to see if we can shed any light on this subject. Oh, sorry.
Later, after the Neoplatonic tradition, Thomas Aquinas probably would say that they're the same thing because God's essence is to exist. And so just saying that he's the cause is not enough.
Right.
Because he exists in a higher mode. So when we describe things, the subject is separate from the predicate.
Nice.
So saying like Socrates exists, you separate, or Socrates' existence is accidental to like the subject, but for God, they're one and the same thing.
Right.
It's existence itself and light itself maybe.
Okay, very good, very good. We have this question here, the source of the light versus the light itself. And you're absolutely right to say this is actually very much like the question of God, the relationship between God, for example, and God's existence, or God's essence, or God's power, or God's knowledge, or God's mind. And the traditional response, not only in Aquinas, though he develops it by in a far more refined form than most people, but there's a doctrine which emerges, even as early as Origen, of the simplicity of God. Now, if it weren't bad enough that we were committed to saying that God is one and God is three, now we're also committed to saying God is simple. Okay, and so it's a traditional puzzle. What do you mean God is simple? I thought God consisted of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Well, yes, but God is simple nevertheless. Now, what does this simplicity mean? We're going to see a variety of interpretations of it. But indeed, one is to identify God with various of God's properties. And in saying that, I don't just mean God is to be identified with a bundle of God's properties or something like that. I really mean each one individually. So God is the same as God's power. God is the same as God's existence. God is the same as God's essence. God is the same as God's knowledge. and wisdom, and so on and so forth. And if you say that, then indeed you can say, well, to say God is light, and God is the source of light, actually those come to the same thing because the source of light, in this case, is the light itself. Now, with other things, that's not true. The lamp, the material lamp, yeah, that's different from the light that it produces. However, and just similarly me, my knowledge, or my power, or my wisdom, or my strength, or whatever, these are distinct from me. But in the case of God, that's not true. Okay, the idea is God is unified with each and every property that God has in a way that individual objects ordinarily is not. And so if we hold that doctrine, we can say actually there's good reason for saying God is light, as opposed to God is the source of light who then sheds light on all of this. After all, the sun seems different from the light that is here bouncing off the tree, for example, and going into this poor fellow's eye. These are photons, that's the sun, those are different things. But in the case of God, according to the doctrine of simplicity, actually that distinction shouldn't be observed. The nature of God is such that God is fully unified and identical with each and every one of God's properties. Now, one thing that seems to follow is that then all of those properties of God are the same thing. God's wisdom is God's power, is God's knowledge, etc., etc. And a lot of people have looked at that doctrine and said, but that's absurd. Wisdom is not the same as knowledge or power or existence or other things. And the response is, well, no, not in general. But God's existence is the same as God's power, is the same as God's wisdom, is the same as God's knowledge. Now, that can be a surprising doctrine. And so it'll take us a while, of course, to come back to it, sort it out, and see what that really means. And it's not until we get to apply this that I think we'll really get a fully developed theory of it. But excellent point. That's something that is here, I think, in the background. Origen is one of the first people to articulate this doctrine and think, yes, God is, despite being a Trinity, nevertheless simple in this particular case. Now, being a Trinity, notice, on this view, it's just a separate question. This is a question of the relationship between God and God's properties. The question of a Trinity, those aren't properties, those are something else. And so this is not meant to contradict this Trinitarian conception. It's just a different aspect of thinking about the nature of God. And so asking, is God one or three? That's one thing. Asking, what's the relationship between God and each individual property of God? That's a different matter. Now, yeah, let's. This is already complicated. We're going through one paragraph. And I'm seeing we're running out of time. This is bad. So let's continue a little bit. Actually, I will jump past the consuming fire. Okay. Having refuted as well as we could every notion that might suggest that we were to think of God as in any degree corporeal, we go on to say that according to strict truth, God is incomprehensible and incapable of being measured. For whatever be the knowledge which we are able to obtain of God, either by perception or reflection, we must of necessity believe that he is by many degrees far better than what we perceive him to be. Okay? For as, if we were to see anyone unable to bear a spark of light or flame from a very small lamp, and were desirous to acquaint such a one, whose vision could not admit a greater degree of light than what we've stated, with the brightness and splendor of the sun, would it be necessary to tell him that the splendor of the sun was unspeakably and uncalculably better and more glorious than this light which he saw? Well, again, he's going back to this Platonic image and saying, take the poor guy who's just emerged from the cave. Can he look at the sun? No. In fact, how many of you go around looking at the sun? It's a bad idea to look at the sun, okay? And Origen is making this sort of obvious point. Yes, it's a very bad idea. People don't go around looking at the sun. And in fact, if you try, what do you see? It's actually very hard to describe what you see. And so he ends up saying, look, God, partly for this reason, being absolutely simple, God is really incomprehensible. God cannot be understood. God cannot be comprehended. However, think about what happens here. We can be aware of the sun, even if we cannot look at it directly and identify things in it. Nevertheless, we can be aware of it. Everything that we see points us in its general direction. And so this doesn't mean we're not aware. We can be aware of God. And moreover, as he says, other things point us toward God. At the end of the Tractatus, Wittgenstein says, what cannot be said must be passed over in silence. And Arthur Pryor is said to have responded to that, well, what can't be said can't be hinted at either. Origen is in effect saying, that's not true. God's nature cannot be articulated, but that doesn't mean it can't be hinted at. And in fact, he thinks the whole world hints at it. Just as everything that we see by virtue of the light of the sun hints at the existence of the sun. So his view is, yeah, we can't really understand the nature of God, partly because we can't understand his. If God is absolutely simple, and God is identical with God's power and God's strength and God's knowledge and God's wisdom, then we really can't understand what that's like. Okay, we don't have a good model of that. We think about the lamp. The lamp is different from the light of the lamp. But in God's case, that isn't really true. And so that means we can't really understand that. We do not have a model that can allow us to comprehend this. But that doesn't mean we can't point people in the direction of God or have some idea which way God lies. Indeed, he says, it won't appear absurd if we employ another similitude to make the matter clearer. Our eyes frequently can't look upon the nature of the light itself, on the substance of the sun. When we behold his splendor or his rays pouring in, perhaps through windows or some small openings to admit the light, we can reflect how great is the supply and source of the light of the body. So in like manner, the works of divine providence and the plan of the whole world are a sort of ray, as it were, of the nature of God in comparison with his real substance and being. So, our understanding is unable of itself to behold God himself as he is, but knows the Father of the world from the beauty of his works and the comeliness of his creatures. God, therefore, is not to be thought of as being a body or existing in a body, but as an uncompounded intellectual nature, admitting within himself no addition of any kind, so that he cannot be believed to have within him a greater and a less, but is such that he is in all parts monos, Greek word for a monad, just a unit, a simple unit. Okay? And so to speak, enos, simple, and is in the mind and source from which all intellectual nature of mind takes its beginning. But mind, for its movements or operation, needs no physical space or sensible magnitude or bodily shape or color, nor any of those adjuncts, which are properties of body or matter. So here is where he's saying, well, God is absolutely simple. God is a unit. God cannot be, for these reasons, comprehended. God is that sort of thing that is the underlying unity. We can't draw distinctions. Absolutely uncompounded intellectual nature, but nevertheless we can know. Why? Aha. He refers to the beauty of creation. The beauty of the world, the beauty of creatures created in the image of God, point us in the direction of God. And so there are things. Notice here, there is an ascent. Why does anybody leave the cave in the first place? There's one important thing that God does here that we haven't mentioned, which is, in effect, pull us in his direction, right? Inspire us. There's some reason why this person walks up the stairs in the first place. And there is, in that sense, something of an almost magnetic property to the light, something that actually attracts us. It attracts, it inspires, it moves us in its direction. Okay? And so that's something that is important. God not only makes all of this possible, is the source of truth, the source of knowledge, the source of life, but also, you might say, draws his creatures naturally toward him. All right, well, we've been talking about the nature of God here. The mind, he says, does bear a certain relationship to God, because after all, the mind is an intellectual image of God. And so there is that too. As the mind is an image of God, to the extent that the mind can know itself, the mind can know something of the nature of God. Now, really, not comprehending God, because God is incomprehensible, nevertheless, there are, as it were, pointers that can, if not articulate, hint at the nature of God just from the nature of the mind itself. Okay, well, so far we've been concentrating on God the Father. So, let me see if I can say something about what he says about Christ. Okay. Yes, he has a great deal to say. Christ is the invisible image. Oh, go ahead.
I just wondered if it was possible to make a synonym between the light and energy, given we don't necessarily have light in our mind, yet we do have electromagnetic, chemical energy in our mind, and relate that to divinity or to God.
Okay, yeah, what does it mean to say the mind is an image of God and is made in the image of God? Last time in Philo, we were talking about this as really meaning that God had stamped our minds with the same stamp with which he had stamped the world, and that was related to the plan of creation. And so basically, Philo's idea is we can actually know something about the world, and actually know something of it a priori, by virtue of that matching between the structure of the mind and the structure of the world. And in fact, I think there's really an underlying argument in Philo, something that I think Origen would endorse, which is that actually rationalism, or maybe really any epistemology, can't make any sense ultimately without God. You can't get objective truth, and you can't get the kind of matching between the structure of the mind and the structure of the world that you need. Now, the rationalist needs it most directly, because the rationalist is somebody who says it is possible to know things a priori. And I now realize I'm using a lot of philosophical jargon here that you may or may not know. Is this familiar to you or not? A priori, rationalism, all of that stuff? Okay, good. I'm seeing lots of nodding heads. That makes me happy. So I will continue to just gesture vaguely here rather than write out definitions. But yeah, the rationalist is going to say, look, I can know something about the world a priori, independently of experience, because I can simply reflect on things, and the structure of my mind in some way provides a key to the structure of the world. Well, by virtue of what is that the case? What allows the structure of the mind to correspond to the structure of the world? Philo's answer is you can't really respond to that without appeal to God. There's no reason why it should, except insofar as God is responsible for both. And indeed, Descartes' answer to his evil demon objection is really to rely on God and God's goodness to provide a match. Now, I think Origen would go further. Actually, suppose we just think that the sources of knowledge are sensation and reflection, i.e., suppose we're just empiricists. Nevertheless, why do we think that our experience of the world actually gives us knowledge of the world? There must be some correspondence between our intellectual capacities, even if they're strictly empiricists in their orientation, and the structure of the world in such a way that the knowledge we gain matches. It's not automatic that such a matching will take place. Now, the alternative, of course, is a kind of skepticism or an idealism that says, well, what we call the world is really just a mental construction, and that's why there's a matching. So that would be an alternative answer. The skeptic might just say, well, knowledge isn't possible. Actually, we have no reason to believe there's a match. The end, game over. And so it's not as if there are no options here, but Origen is saying, well, look, I don't want to say that the world is just a creation of my own mind. Sorry, idealist. And I don't want to say knowledge is just impossible. Sorry, skeptic. And so he's in effect saying, that's the only other option. It must be that the mind is an image of God, and what that really means is that it reflects the structure of at least some aspects of God's mind in a way that the world also reflects things. So I think we can repeat the image we had in Philo of God really creating the mind and giving it capacities, but also creating the world and doing those with the same kind of stamp, by virtue of the same light. Now, Origen doesn't really go into the nature of the light, but that brings us really to this question of, well, what is Christ? And what do we, if God is really playing the role of the sun or the light of the sun here, or both, where are the forms? What is it to which we directly manage to link in order to gain objective knowledge? Well, this is the word. Okay? And that is identified with Christ. Okay? And the realm of the forms identified with Christ says, oh wait, Jesus is now a carpenter. What's the relationship between him and the realm of forms? There's going to be a lot to be said about that, which we'll get to soon enough. But basically the idea is going to have to be that there is a soul. Other souls fall. They fall away from this initial impression of the forms into the material world, and so are alienated from God and have to be brought back. But one soul didn't fall, and that soul is the soul of Jesus, who has then remained united with the forms. And so there's a kind of union between a soul and the realm of forms, which enables Christ to be divine and intimately linked to the mind of God, nevertheless also human. Yes?
Doesn't that create a problem?
Oh, yeah.
Because Christ, because then Christ is independent of God. They're two separate individuals.
Well, okay, good. What is the relationship between God the Father here and God the Son? This is going to look a lot like the distinction between the source of light and light.
Didn't the forms all pull from the forms of good, which would be God? So
That's right. Think about Philo's idea. Look, these are just ideas in the mind of God. Okay? And so, indeed, the Greek term here is ideo, idea, okay, for the forms. But they have to exist out of any of our minds. Well, they are ideas, but they're ideas in the mind of God. And so here I've drawn the realm of forms and the Son as two different units. But really, these are ideas in God's mind in the first place. And so Christ is to be identified with, well, the collection of ideas in the mind of God. Is that different from God? Well, no.